welcome to Rotted Reviews, and today I'd like to talk about a movie that's a little bit out of time. You see, in 1983, we were talking more about slashers, Leatherface. We had 3 Friday the 13th movies up until this point. And the whole classical Amicus anthologies and the monster Dracula kind of movies of the 60s and 70s were just feeling a little bit like a bygone era. However, in 1983, we also had a movie come out that was not necessarily an homage, but just a movie that felt a little bit dated even when it first came out, but I think is worthy of some recognition. You see, of those days of yore, we had kind of grand, traditional, spooky feels to things, and we had iconic actors that were also associated with that time and not necessarily associated with the 1980s. Actors like Vincent Price, Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, so on and so forth. And whether it was foolishness or bravery, in 1983 a movie did come out that was more akin to the age of yore. It was a movie that was unafraid to have big spooky mansions in the dead of night during a thunderous downpour, and those iconic actors like Vincent Price, Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, and John Carradine. It really felt like a 1970s movie that somehow happened to be made and come out in 1983. And of course, it really couldn't hold up against the slashers and the things that were driving the teenagers out to the theaters in droves at that point, but I still think it has a place in my heart, and it's something that I wanted to showcase here today. Now, I know by experience that doing classical movies in this channel typically doesn't provide the analytical booms that one might be looking for, but even so, I feel obligated and privileged to talk about classic movies such as the 1983 movie House of the Long Shadows. And this movie opens up with Desi Arnaz Jr. playing Mr. McGee, who is a novelist that was more interested in the paycheck than he is about character building, and his publisher puts to him that he could not possibly come up with a work comparable to Wuthering Heights. And of course, Mr. McGee takes umbrage with this and says not only can he do it, he can do it in 24 hours. It's a simple process. You just have to let your imagination run away with you and just roll with it. So a bet is made for $20,000 no less that Mr. McGee could come up, I keep wanting to say Mr. Magoo, that Mr. McGee could come up with a book comparable to Wuthering Heights in 24 hours, and he submits that all he really needs is an isolated location. So of course his publisher has the perfect idea.
How do you fancy an old manor house? Hasn't been lived in for years. It's certainly an isolated part of the country, and as for atmosphere...
Sounds great.
Now, hold on, dear boy. I mean, it really has been empty for over 40 years. I hope there'd be no electricity.
Even better. I can type by candlelight.
Joking.
It's perfect for what I've got in mind.
And of course, things go wrong when Mr. McGee gets to the big estate, and all of a sudden, people start showing up one by one. At first, he's met with a couple of caretakers of the house. Previously, nobody had ever mentioned that there even were any caretakers, but clearly, some things have been taken care of in this house, and this kind of explained why that is. So he has a couple caretakers, and then somebody else shows up unannounced, and then somebody else shows up unannounced, and somebody else shows up unannounced, until finally it's a big full house full of people, including the classic actors that I mentioned before. And with the decrepit nature of the setting and the oddness of the timing of the circumstances, the fact that all of a sudden this has been turned into Grand Central Station full of characters after having been dormant for 40 years, and it just so happens on the night that Mr. McGee gets there, it kind of lets the imagination run wild with, is this kind of a ghostly thing? Is this a haunting thing? Is this simply a family getting together and having tales of murder? And so on and so forth. It really leaves a lot of ambiguity on the table, and purposefully so, because you as the audience member are kind of thinking and theorizing and trying to figure out what the fuck is actually going on here. And I guarantee that whatever your thoughts are, you may be right, you may be wrong, but either way, this movie will take you on a roller coaster ride until you get to the final destination. Now, as much as I try to advocate for classic horror movies, I am of the opinion that they are not necessarily without sin, and we must look at everything warts and all. And this movie does have some warts to it, most notably pacing. Although this movie does have a lot of good twists and turns and characters that are going to keep you guessing from start to finish, this does have some pacing issues, and it has some major lulls to it. Around the 1/3, 1/2 mark, there's some pre-dinner kind of things going on here that just is a bit of a snooze fest. And considering the nature of how some of these characters just kind of one by one trickle in, we don't even see Vincent Price until about the 40-minute mark into this movie. Which honestly is kind of one more nail in the coffin as far as it competing with the other movies of the 1980s, which did have a little bit more of a breakneck speed, trying to get as much guts and gore and Tom Savini out there as possible to chill and thrill the teenagers. So to have something that is a little bit slower and more contemplative with some older actors in it, it really just wasn't setting itself up for a grand amount of success. But I did have a massive amount of fun with this, and I submit that I had not nearly as much fun as the actors themselves. I was just watching and marvel at the screen as I was looking at these actors that were just having a grand time eating things up.
Time has such little respect for man's vanity, such little regard for his possessions.
Listen,
Please don't interrupt me whilst I am soliloquizing.
Veteran actors like Lee, Price, Carradine, and Cushing also kind of knowing that this was going to be one of their last hurrahs. Certainly one of their last hurrahs together. This is actually the only movie in which all four starred at the same time, but they had kind of worked together in one form or another over the course of the last few decades, and I kind of think that there was some writing on the wall as far as this may be some of their last rides working together in some fashion. And so they really made the most of it. It never really felt mournful in that regard. It instead had a sense of giddiness to it as they were just eating up the scenery and eating up their lines and just having a grand time being in this one last motion picture. Obviously, for many of them, this was not the last stop of their career. Far from it. But for many of them, I do believe that this was kind of their last stop in terms of their iconic horror selves. Not only seeing the writing on the wall for their acting careers in this kind of fashion, but also for this style of cinema. To have one last grand adventure together, I think is worth watching on that note at least. But then beyond the performances, to also have a movie that is interesting, captivating, and keeps me on my toes from start to finish, well, that's something that I have to stand up here in front of you and say that I heartily recommend it. And so if you haven't seen this movie, I implore you, wait for a night where you're ready for something a little bit slower, a little bit more thoughtful, and a little bit whimsical, and then try out the 1983 movie, House of the Long Shadows. Thank you so much for watching here. I look forward to seeing you on my next video. Remember, next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.